when a young boy ran frantically up to the school bus driver one crisp autumn morning, his voice quivering with fear as he pleaded, "Please help me. I need to get out of my house." The driver nearly brushed it off as a misunderstanding or just another child's overactive imagination. Yet there was something about the urgency in the boy's eyes, a haunted look that suggested far more than a childish whim, that made the driver pause. In that split second, the driver realized this was no ordinary request. It was a desperate cry for help, and it would change everything from that day forward. Before we delve into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of courage, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Connor was 12 years old and had just been enrolled at Oakwood Middle School a few weeks earlier. He was smaller than most kids his age, with thin arms and a pale complexion that seemed to stand out in a crowd. His new classmates knew little about him, only that he was a foster child placed with Michael and Rebecca Reynolds. They had a reputation in the neighborhood for their involvement in community events and charities, often hosting barbecues for local fundraisers or volunteering at the nearby senior center. On the surface, they appeared to be the model foster parents, generous and conscientious, always ready to help with a smile. At school, Connor's presence was hardly felt at first. He tended to keep to himself, sitting at the far end of the cafeteria or choosing the emptiest corner of the playground during recess. He barely made eye contact and spoke so softly that teachers had to lean in just to hear him. Most assumed he was simply shy, adjusting to a new environment and new peers. But there were a few who took special notice: Mr. Jones, his homeroom teacher, and Mrs. Anderson, the school counselor. Mr. Jones was in his late 20s, tall and lean with brown hair that curled at the edges of his forehead. He had an empathetic gaze that seemed able to read the unspoken feelings beneath a child's expression. Years ago, Mr. Jones himself had been in the foster care system, and though he rarely shared the details of his own history, he remained keenly sensitive to the signs of a troubled home life. Mrs. Anderson, on the other hand, was in her early 40s and had a warm but firm approach to counseling. She was the kind of person who believed that listening was the first and most powerful step in helping a child. From the moment Connor set foot in her office, her instincts told her something was amiss. It began with small observations: faint bruises on Connor's arms, a reluctance to participate in group games during gym, and a tendency to flinch at sudden movements or loud voices. If a soccer ball came flying near him in the field, he would freeze rather than duck or catch it. If a chair squeaked, he would jump. These reactions seemed disproportionate to the actual events, suggesting a background of deeper fear. Mr. Jones noticed that whenever he or any teacher tried to offer Connor assistance, the boy would quickly say, "I'm fine," in a voice tinged with anxiety, as though he believed any attention could be dangerous. The first real conversation Mr. Jones had with Connor occurred after class. He had asked Connor to stay behind for a moment. Once the other students filed out, Mr. Jones spoke gently. "Connor, I've noticed you've been quiet. Is everything okay? Do you need anything?" Connor shifted in his seat, his eyes flickering with apprehension. He hesitated for a second, then said, "I'm okay. Just tired." But that answer seemed rehearsed. Mr. Jones pressed no further at that time, hoping that by demonstrating care without prying, he might earn Connor's trust. Mrs. Anderson, who had been alerted to the possibility of Connor having difficulty adjusting, invited him to her office for a casual talk. She led him into the room, which was decorated with motivational posters, bean bags, and colorful cushions designed to put children at ease. She asked about his interests, books, music, favorite classes, and Connor answered in short, guarded phrases. He would say, "I like to draw," or "math is okay," with an almost inaudible voice. The conversation never touched on his life outside school, and Mrs. Anderson noted how swiftly he redirected the topic whenever it edged too close to his home. She couldn't confirm anything yet, but a twinge of worry settled in her mind that day. On the morning Connor ran up to the bus driver pleading for help, it was a gray, chilly day. He was the last child to board the bus, which was unusual because he usually came on time, if not early, preferring to avoid the rush of kids who piled into the aisle. That day, though, Connor arrived late, out of breath, his jacket unzipped and his school bag half dangling from his shoulder. The bus driver, Mr. Milton, was about to close the doors when Connor banged on them from the outside. Startled, Mr. Milton opened up and saw Connor's face streaked with fresh tears. The boy whispered, "I can't stay there anymore." Mr. Milton felt a jolt of alarm but struggled momentarily to grasp the gravity of the situation. He had seen children cry about leaving a favorite toy behind or because they had an argument with a sibling. However, Connor's face conveyed something entirely different, a trembling urgency that most kids never display just for missing breakfast or forgetting their homework. Mr. Milton knelt down and said, "What's wrong, son?" Connor didn't elaborate much, just repeated, "Please, I need help." After seating Connor, Mr. Milton continued his route, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something serious was going on. When they arrived at Oakwood Middle School, Mr. Milton sought out Mr. Jones immediately. With the bus parked in its usual spot, he made his way to the main office, found Mr. Jones, and recounted what Connor had said. Mr. Jones could feel the weight of the situation before Mr. Milton even finished describing the boy's tearful plea. He thanked the bus driver, promising to speak with Connor and to inform Mrs. Anderson. When Connor arrived in homeroom that same morning, Mr. Jones noticed a reddish welt on the boy's left cheek, partly concealed by the hood of his sweater. The bruise hadn't been there the previous day. It confirmed his growing suspicion that something truly alarming was happening at Connor's foster home. After class, Mr. Jones asked Connor to join him in the counselor's office. Mrs. Anderson greeted them, her eyes reflecting her concern as soon as she saw the mark on Connor's face. She asked him gently, "Would you like to tell us what happened?" Connor's lips quivered, and for a moment it looked as though he might speak. But fear took over and he clammed up. He muttered something about slipping in the bathroom and insisted it was fine, though he wouldn't meet her gaze. Mrs. Anderson exchanged a quick glance with Mr. Jones. It was the same story children often repeated when they were coached to hide something. Despite Connor's reticence, the signs were becoming too numerous to ignore. Mr. Jones and Mrs. Anderson agreed they would start documenting everything: the bruises, the suspicious explanations, the changes in behavior, any evidence that might indicate abuse. They also decided to keep a close, watchful eye on Connor, hoping that when he felt safe enough, he would confide in someone. Their school had protocols for reporting suspected abuse, and they intended to follow them. Neither wanted to be hasty in accusing Michael and Rebecca Reynolds without evidence, but they would not allow a child to remain in harm's way if they could prevent it. Meanwhile, at home, Connor was indeed living under the oppressive shadow of Michael and Rebecca. They were adept at maintaining appearances for outsiders. At community gatherings, they flaunted their generosity and kindness, telling everyone how grateful they were to foster a child who needed a loving home. Yet behind closed doors, their demeanor shifted drastically. Michael's temper was volatile, triggered by small annoyances like a cup left on the table or a chore not completed to his exact standards. Rebecca was subtler, but her cruelty was no less damaging. Belittling remarks, cold silences, manipulative emotional tactics that chipped away at Connor's sense of self-worth. Connor's bedroom was sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, a small wooden desk, and a single overhead light that flickered annoyingly sometimes. He had few possessions, most of them hand-me-downs from previous foster children who had come and gone through the Reynolds home. The only thing truly his own was a sketchbook he kept hidden beneath his mattress. Whenever he felt scared or upset, he would draw. His pictures grew more disturbing over time. Outlines of figures with angry faces, small silhouettes curled into corners, swirling patterns of darkness that felt like a window into his internal turmoil. One day, in art class, Mr. Jones, who also taught that elective, walked around the room, glancing at each student's work. When he reached Connor, He noticed the boy had drawn a house with closed windows and a towering figure looming above it, scrawled in black. There was a small figure curled at the base of the drawing, arms over its head in a posture of absolute terror. Mr. Jones said softly, "That's pretty intense, Connor. Is everything all right?" Connor stiffened and quickly flipped the page. "It's nothing," he murmured. Mr. Jones didn't press the issue in front of the entire class, but made a mental note to talk to Connor later. By the time the school day ended, Connor was gone, hurrying to catch the bus or perhaps to avoid any further questions. Mr. Jones watched him leave and felt a pang in his chest. He recognized that kind of fear. It was the same paralyzing dread that gripped children in unsafe homes, the desperation to hide the truth so they wouldn't face even worse punishment if it ever came to light. Mr. Jones resolved to talk to Mrs. Anderson again, but it would have to wait until the next morning. That evening, Connor faced yet another confrontation at home. Michael had discovered a chore left unfinished. Connor had forgotten to scrub the kitchen sink after washing the dishes, and flew into a rage. With a furious glare, Michael seized Connor's arm and yanked him away from the table. Rebecca stood in the corner, her lips pressed together, neither intervening nor de-escalating. "Can't you do anything right?" Michael shouted, towering over the trembling boy. Connor didn't dare speak. Any defense of himself might provoke more anger. He braced for what came next. A sharp slap across his arm, hard enough to leave a bruise that would darken by morning. That night, Connor sat on his bed, tears silently rolling down his cheek. He retrieved his sketchbook from its hiding place and began drawing, though his hands shook as he held the pencil. This time, he sketched an image of an open door with a faint light shining through, as though offering a small glimmer of hope in the darkness. He labeled it Escape, scrawling the word in tiny letters at the top corner of the page. When he finished, he carefully tucked the sketchbook away, listening to the angry murmurs of Michael and Rebecca through the walls. At school the next day, Connor was quieter than ever. He kept his hood on all morning, even though the classrooms were warm. During lunch, he sat alone in a far corner of the cafeteria, staring at his tray without eating. Olivia, a girl in his homeroom who had occasionally tried to talk to him, decided to approach. She had chestnut-brown hair tied in a ponytail and bright, curious eyes. She was no stranger to the complexities of family life, having grown up in a single-parent household. She carried her tray over to Connor's table and asked, "Mind if I sit here?" Connor shrugged, neither inviting her nor pushing her away. She took that as a silent permission. For a moment they both ate in silence. Then Olivia spoke up again. "You seem sad. Are you okay?" Connor glanced at her, unsure whether to confide in her. He just shook his head. She reached out a hand as though she wanted to comfort him, but he flinched, pulling away involuntarily. Embarrassed, she retracted her hand, feeling the air crackle with tension. "It's all right, no worries," she said hastily. "I just wanted to check on you." After an awkward pause, Connor said, "Thanks." It was the most sincere word Olivia had heard from him. Then the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. She picked up her tray and offered him a small smile. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here," she said. Connor gave her a hesitant nod, touched by her kindness yet terrified of the repercussions if he opened up to the wrong person. He was torn between wanting help and fearing what his foster parents might do if they found out he was telling others about his home life. That same afternoon, Mr. Jones and Mrs. Anderson met in her office to compare notes. "He came to the bus driver this morning, practically begging for help," Mr. Jones began. "But he refused to say much when we tried to talk to him. He has new bruises on his face and arms. This is getting too obvious to ignore." Mrs. Anderson sighed, rubbing her temples. "We need to make an official report to social services. But we also have to be cautious. We have to handle this properly. You know how quickly allegations can spiral, and we can't let this slip through the cracks." They wrote down every detail, The times Connor came in with bruises, the record of him asking the bus driver for help, the drawings Mr. Jones had seen, and Connor's persistent anxiety. Then, following the school protocol, Mrs. Anderson contacted social services. She spoke with Mr. Carter, a social worker who specialized in child welfare cases. She explained the situation, the physical signs, and Connor's emotional distress. Mr. Carter listened carefully, asking questions about the nature of the bruises, how frequent they seemed to appear, and whether Connor had ever openly admitted abuse. Though he hadn't directly confessed, the pattern was deeply concerning. Mr. Carter assured them he would take action promptly. The next step involved Mr. Carter scheduling a visit to the Reynolds home. But these visits were often announced in advance, and that gave foster parents time to cover up any signs of abuse or coach the child into lying. The Reynolds, skilled at public relations, likely knew how to appear squeaky clean in front of any official. Still, Mr. Carter believed in thorough investigations, so he planned not only a scheduled visit but also intended to make unannounced checks if necessary. Connor sensed a mounting tension in the days that followed. Michael and Rebecca seemed on edge, especially after a letter arrived from social services, informing them of an upcoming routine inspection. Michael, in particular, became more controlling, forbidding Connor from taking the bus one morning, insisting he drive him to school instead. During the drive, Michael's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. "You better not be telling anyone any lies," he warned, his tone menacing. Connor stared at his lap, trembling. I'm not," he managed to whisper. At school, Mr. Jones and Mrs. Anderson noticed Connor's growing apprehension. He seemed perpetually tense, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Still, they could offer only gentle reassurance, reminding him that if he needed to talk, their doors were always open. Olivia continued to try to befriend him, sometimes offering him half her sandwich at lunch or a piece of candy she had saved from home. He accepted these small kindnesses wordlessly, and she hoped that in time, he might open up to her. When the scheduled home visit from Mr. Carter finally arrived, Michael and Rebecca had everything staged perfectly. The living room was immaculate, with family photos and homemade art projects displayed in strategic spots. A pitcher of lemonade stood on the coffee table alongside neatly arranged cookies. Rebecca put on her most gracious smile, offering Mr. Carter refreshments and praising Connor as a delightful addition to our family. Connor was present but said little, eyes fixed on the floor. He had been warned about the consequences if he spoke out of turn. Mr. Carter took a polite sip of lemonade before setting the glass down. He asked a series of questions about Connor's routine, his hobbies, his adjustment to a new school. Michael answered in confident, measured tones, claiming that Connor was quiet but well-behaved, just a bit shy. Rebecca chimed in, saying they were doing their best to help him open up, and that any bruises he had were from childish clumsiness. They insisted Connor often tripped or bumped into things. Eventually, Mr. Carter asked if he could speak with Connor alone, which was standard procedure. Michael and Rebecca exchanged wary looks but agreed. They left the room, though Michael lingered in the hallway, perhaps within earshot. Mr. Carter moved closer to Connor, lowering his voice. "Connor, if there's anything you'd like to share about how you're feeling or what goes on at home, I'm here to listen. No one can hurt you for telling the truth." Connor looked up, tears threatening to form in his eyes. He wanted so badly to say something, to explain the pain in his arms, the nightmares that haunted him, the fear that dictated every aspect of his life. But he also feared the repercussions. Michael's threats echoed in his mind. Connor mumbled, "I'm fine," and Mr. Carter recognized the coached answer. He gently continued, "Are you sure, Connor? Because if you ever need help, you can call me, day or night." Then he slid a business card across the table. Connor took it hesitantly, not daring to meet Mr. Carter's gaze. With the conversation going nowhere, Mr. Carter eventually stood and thanked Michael and Rebecca for their cooperation. He left the home with no concrete evidence of abuse, but the encounter left him uneasy. He had seen too many similar cases where the surface was polished and the real truth was buried. Days passed, and the bruises on Connor's arms faded, replaced by new ones. He became even more withdrawn at school, as if he were slowly vanishing behind an invisible wall of fear. Mr. Jones grew restless, wanting to intervene more directly but constrained by the protocols. He met again with Mrs. Anderson. "We can't just wait for everything to fall into place. Every day we delay could mean he's suffering more," he said, frustration evident in his voice. Mrs. Anderson nodded. "I'll speak with Mr. Carter again. We have to find a way to confirm what's happening without endangering Connor further." Meanwhile, Olivia noticed that Connor had stopped bringing lunch from home. He said he simply wasn't hungry, but she suspected something was wrong. One day, she offered him half of her sandwich again, but this time he refused, saying that Michael and Rebecca didn't like him accepting food from other people. "Why not?" she asked. "They just said not to," Connor replied, his eyes darting away. Olivia frowned, deciding it might be better not to push him. But her worries for him deepened. One afternoon, as the last bell rang and students poured into the hallways to head home, Mr. Jones spotted Connor walking alone, looking even paler than usual. He approached the boy and said softly, "Connor, would you like a ride home today? I wanted to ask you something about your art project." Connor glanced around nervously. "I have to take the bus," he replied. Mr. Jones gently insisted, "It will only take a moment." Reluctantly, Connor agreed. He followed Mr. Jones to his classroom, where they sat down at a desk in the corner. Mr. Jones spoke gently, "Listen, I know things at home aren't right. I've been there. I grew up in a rough foster home too. I also know it feels terrifying to speak up." Connor's lip trembled. He forced himself to look at Mr. Jones, tears pooling in his eyes. "They said I'm ungrateful," he whispered. "That I should be thankful for what they're giving me. But if I say anything," his voice wavered. Mr. Jones reached out and placed a comforting hand on Connor's shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone. People are here to help you. Mrs. Anderson, me, even the bus driver. We all care about you." For a moment, it looked like Connor might confess everything, but the fear in his eyes flared again. He pulled back, wiping his tears roughly with the back of his hand, and dashed out the door, leaving Mr. Jones with a heavy heart. Later that week, Mr. Carter arrived at the school unannounced. He asked to speak with Connor privately, this time away from Michael and Rebecca. School was often a safer environment for children to speak their mind. Connor was called into the counselor's office, where Mr. Carter, Mrs. Anderson, and Mr. Jones waited. The presence of all three made Connor tense up at first, but Mr. Carter explained softly, "Connor, we just want to make sure everything is okay. This is a safe space." Connor took a deep breath, glancing at Mr. Jones, who gave him a reassuring nod. Mrs. Anderson spoke gently, "We've been worried about you. If something is happening at home, telling us might help stop it." Connor felt sweat trickling down the back of his neck. He looked at their concerned faces and realized they genuinely wanted to protect him. Slowly, he rolled up the sleeve of his sweatshirt, revealing a fresh bruise around his forearm, shaped like the imprint of someone's fingers. Tears filled his eyes as he explained in a halting voice, "He grabs me really hard sometimes, hits me when he's angry. She just watches. Says I deserve it." A hush fell over the room, the collective horror palpable. Mr. Carter gently reached out his hand, but not to touch Connor, just to let him know he was there. Connor sniffed, wiped his nose, and whispered, "I don't want to go back there. I can't." Mr. Carter nodded slowly, scribbling down notes. "You won't," he said gently. "We're going to help you." With that admission, the wheels of the system began turning more decisively. Mr. Carter contacted law enforcement to assist with a proper welfare check at the Reynolds home, carrying Connor's testimony with him as probable cause. Meanwhile, Connor stayed in the counselor's office, waiting anxiously, tears still trickling down his face. Mr. Jones stayed by his side, gently stroking the boy's back. He remembered the fear he once felt in a similar situation, the paralyzing dread of not knowing what would happen next, yet also a flicker of relief that someone might finally intervene. Mrs. Anderson stepped out to handle phone calls and to coordinate with the front office, ensuring that Michael or Rebecca couldn't just show up and take Connor before the authorities arrived. That evening, the police and Mr. Carter visited the Reynolds home again, this time unannounced, this time armed with more than just a vague suspicion. Connor had spoken, albeit sparingly, providing enough detail about his bruises and the frightening outbursts of anger he endured. The Reynolds were taken aback by the sudden arrival. Michael erupted in indignation, accusing the system of meddling and claiming that Connor was a liar who fabricated stories for attention. Rebecca put on a tearful display, insisting they had done nothing wrong, that they provided for Connor's every need. But the evidence, the bruises, and Connor's own words carried weight. The police had enough reason to remove Connor from the home on an emergency protective order, placing him temporarily in a shelter. That night, Connor packed up his meager belongings, a few clothes, a toothbrush, his beloved sketchbook. He left with Mr. Carter and a local police officer. As they walked down the front steps, Connor caught a glimpse of Michael's enraged face and Rebecca's icy stare. He felt terror but also a strange sense of liberation, like a door he had sketched in pencil so many times had finally opened. He clutched Mr. Jones's phone number in his pocket, which had been quietly passed to him. The weight of that number, and the memory of Mr. Jones's comforting tone, lent him a sliver of hope. Once at the shelter, Connor was given a bed in a small, clean room with cheerful posters on the wall. A social worker introduced herself as Ms. Baker and helped him settle in. "You're safe here," she said with a gentle smile, showing him where to find towels and explaining the shelter's schedule. But even as he tried to absorb her words, Connor's mind still whirled with fear. What if Michael and Rebecca convinced everyone he was lying? What if he was sent back? That night, Connor could barely sleep, though he felt a hint of relief in every breath, free for once from the possibility of hearing Michael's angry footsteps approaching his door. The news spread fast among the teachers at Oakwood Middle School. When Mr. Jones learned that Connor had been removed from the home, he felt both relief and new anxiety. Removing a child from an abusive situation was only the first step. There was still a long road ahead. He spoke with Mrs. Anderson in her office that morning. "You know, this is going to be hard on him, going through the system and all the investigations," Mr. Jones said, his voice tinged with worry. Mrs. Anderson nodded. "Yes, and we have to be there for him every step of the way. We can't let him feel alone." A few days later, Connor returned to school under the temporary custody arrangement, living at the shelter. He looked exhausted and shaken, but also faintly relieved. Some of the kids noticed he wore different clothes than before. Slightly worn, obviously donated, but at least they fit him well enough. He avoided everyone's eyes, as though he feared judgment or pity. When Olivia saw him, she walked over, her face filled with concern. "Hey," she said softly. Connor managed a small smile in return. It was the warmest expression she had ever seen him wear. Though it vanished quickly, she took it as a sign he was at least open to kindness. During homeroom, Mr. Jones asked Connor to step outside for a moment. They stood in the hallway, and Mr. Jones spoke quietly. "I wanted to let you know if there's anything you need, you just have to ask. I'm proud of you for speaking up." Connor stared at his sneakers, nodding. "It's just, I'm worried," he admitted, voice trembling. "They won't leave me alone now, will they?" Mr. Jones placed a reassuring hand on Connor's shoulder. "The authorities are handling it. Michael and Rebecca won't be allowed near you without supervision, especially now that charges are being considered." The mention of charges made Connor's eyes widen. He swallowed hard, a mix of fear and relief swirling in his stomach. "Okay," he murmured. Over the following weeks, the legal process began taking shape. A court hearing was scheduled to review Connor's case, assess the validity of the abuse allegations, and determine the next step. Michael and Rebecca, through their attorney, contested the allegations, vehemently denying any wrongdoing. They claimed to be victims of a misunderstanding, or worse, that Connor was troubled and creating stories. But the Social Services Department, with Mr. Carter's assistance, compiled evidence: photographs of bruises, transcripts of interviews with teachers and the bus driver, and Connor's own testimony. Mr. Jones and Mrs. Anderson wrote detailed statements, describing everything they had observed. In the meantime, Connor remained in the shelter. Each morning, he came to school, gradually adjusting to a more stable routine. He even began talking more with Olivia, sometimes sketching in his notebook while she read a book nearby. One afternoon, as they sat in the quiet corner of the library, Olivia asked softly, "Do you want to show me what you draw?" Connor hesitated, but then, perhaps moved by her kindness, he opened the sketchbook. She flipped through pages of dark images, towering figures, tear-stained faces, a child cowering in a corner. Each page told a story of pain. But there were also sketches of doors opening, beams of light, hands reaching out. Olivia felt tears welling in her eyes. "You're really brave," she whispered. Connor shook his head. "I'm not," he said. But deep down, he felt a flicker of appreciation for her empathy. On the day of the hearing, Connor was excused from school to appear in family court with Mr. Carter and a court-appointed child advocate. He sat nervously on a hard bench in the hallway outside the courtroom, biting his nails and fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. When he was called inside, the cavernous room, with its high ceiling and wooden benches, made him feel small. The judge was a middle-aged woman with a stern but compassionate demeanor. She listened intently as the attorneys presented their cases, reviewing evidence and witness statements. Connor was asked to testify briefly, and though his voice shook, he recounted how Michael would lash out in anger, how Rebecca would turn her back or scold him for making Michael angry. He explained how he was threatened to stay silent, how he tried to endure it until he couldn't anymore. When the judge asked him why he finally spoke up, Connor paused. He cast a glance at Mr. Jones, who was seated in the gallery. Then he said, "I realized there were people who cared about what happened to me. Mr. Jones, Mrs. Anderson, and some kids at school. I didn't want to be scared anymore." Michael and Rebecca's attorney tried to paint Connor's story as exaggerated or misrepresented, insinuating that his bruises could have come from typical childhood accident. However, the judge seemed unconvinced by those arguments. In the end, the court decided to place Connor in temporary protective custody under the foster system, revoking Michael and Rebecca's license and restricting any contact they might attempt. Criminal proceedings were also set in motion against them for possible child endangerment and abuse. It was far from a complete victory. Legal battles could drag on for months or years, but it was a decisive step in freeing Connor from that household. When Connor returned to school the next day, a subdued relief clung to him like a soft veil. He was still anxious, unsure about the future, but at least he knew he wouldn't have to go back to Michael and Rebecca. During lunch, Mr. Jones found Connor sitting alone again. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Connor shrugged, and Mr. Jones sat down. After a brief silence, Mr. Jones said, "You were very brave in court." Connor shifted uncomfortably. "It was scary," he admitted. Mr. Jones nodded. "I know. But you did the right thing, and you're not alone in this." In the following weeks, Connor remained in the shelter, but social services began searching for a more permanent foster home. Ms. Baker, the social worker at the shelter, told him they were looking for a good match, someone who could provide a stable environment and the emotional support he needed. Connor nodded politely whenever the topic came up, but inwardly, he dreaded moving into another unknown place. What if it turned out just like the Reynolds home? One afternoon, Mr. Jones was working late in his classroom when Mrs. Anderson stopped by. They had been in frequent contact with Mr. Carter, discussing Connor's well-being. Mr. Jones was straightening some papers when he turned to Mrs. Anderson and said, You know, I've been thinking about something for a while. I have a spare room, and I know what it's like to be bounced around in the system." Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened slightly. "Are you saying you want to foster Connor?" Mr. Jones nodded slowly. "I've talked to my partner about it, and we both agree we want to help him. I know it's a big step, but I feel like it's the right thing to do." Mrs. Anderson smiled, relief and happiness reflecting in her eyes. "That's wonderful. You'd be perfect for him. You understand what he's gone through. But you'll have to go through the official process. Background checks, a home study, everything." Mr. Jones agreed, acknowledging that it wouldn't be quick or easy. Nevertheless, he was determined. He had lived through his own struggles in foster care and remembered how a caring adult mentor had helped turn his life around. Now, he had a chance to be that mentor, and possibly more, for Connor. A few days later, Mr. Jones pulled Connor aside after class. "I wanted you to know that I've applied to become your foster parent," he said, his voice gentle but filled with hope. Connor blinked, not quite believing what he was hearing. "You want me to live with you?" he asked, voice trembling. Mr. Jones nodded. "If it's something you feel comfortable with. I just want you to have a stable home, and I'd like to give you that if I can." Connor was speechless. Emotions swirled in his chest. Relief, doubt, a tender gratitude he could hardly put into words. In the end, he just nodded, tears threatening to spill down his cheeks. For once, they were tears not of fear or sadness, but of cautious hope. The process took time, as Mr. Jones had to undergo an extensive check, interviews, and a home inspection to ensure his living situation was suitable. The school community buzzed with the news, and while some parents questioned whether it was appropriate for a teacher to foster a student, most supported the move, recognizing it as a compassionate act. Olivia, upon hearing the update, said to Connor, "That's so cool, you'll have a safe place now." He managed a shy smile. "I think so too," he replied quietly, his cheeks warming with an emotion he was still learning to identify as excitement. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Michael and Rebecca continued. More revelations emerged during the investigation, including testimonies from neighbors who heard shouting matches, and from other children who had briefly stayed with the Reynolds and recounted similar mistreatment. The community that once hailed Michael and Rebecca as model citizens began to see the cracks in their facade, though some still clung to denial. "They were always so nice at the church bake sales," one neighbor lamented, struggling to reconcile the public persona with the now well-substantiated allegations of abuse. When the day finally arrived that Connor could move in with Mr. Jones, it felt surreal. He walked out of the shelter with his modest backpack and a small suitcase containing clothes donated by local charities. Ms. Baker gave him a warm hug goodbye. "I'm proud of you," she said, "and I want you to remember, if you ever feel unsafe or scared, you call me, okay?" Connor nodded. He followed Mr. Jones to his car, heart pounding with each step. As they drove to Mr. Jones's home, an apartment in a quiet neighborhood, Connor gazed out the window, letting himself imagine, for the first time in a long time, that the future might hold something other than fear. Mr. Jones's apartment was modest but cozy, with a small living room, a neatly organized kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. "This will be your room," he said, leading Connor to a space with a bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking a line of trees. There were posters of landscapes and a bookshelf filled with novels and art supplies. "I didn't know what you'd like, so I just set up the basics," Mr. Jones added hesitantly. Connor's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the desk where a brand-new sketchbook lay. He picked it up, feeling the smooth cover beneath his fingertips, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He turned to Mr. Jones, eyes brimming with tears, and whispered, "Thank you." Over the next few days, Connor settled into his new routine. Mr. Jones set reasonable rules: bedtime, homework policy, a rotating chore schedule that was fair and never enforced with anger. The first time Connor accidentally spilled a glass of juice on the floor, he braced for a blow, but instead, Mr. Jones just handed him paper towels and helped him clean it up, smiling reassuringly. "It's okay," he said. "Accidents happen." The simple act of kindness left Connor quietly stunned. He returned to his new bedroom and sank onto the bed, letting out a long breath. Maybe, just maybe, a normal life wasn't a fantasy after all. At school, Connor's demeanor began to change in small but noticeable ways. He stopped wearing his hood so frequently and started talking more in class discussions. He even shared a few jokes with Olivia during lunch, though he still blushed whenever he spoke more than a few sentences. Mrs. Anderson beamed whenever she saw him in the hallway, thankful that her instincts had been right and that this once frightened child now had a chance at healing. One afternoon, while Mr. Jones was grading papers in the living room, Connor approached hesitantly. "Mr. Jones," he began, chewing on his lower lip. Would you like to see my drawings?" Mr. Jones set down his pen. "I'd love to," he said warmly. Connor retrieved his old sketchbook, the one filled with dark images of fear, and his new one, which he had started since moving in. He opened the old sketchbook first, flipping through the pages of ominous silhouettes and harsh lines. "This is how I felt before," he explained softly, "trapped, afraid." Mr. Jones listened quietly, his eyes filled with compassion. Then Connor opened the new sketchbook. Inside were drawings of sunlight streaming through windows, smiling faces, and most recently, a portrait of Mr. Jones reading a book to a small boy in the corner of a softly lit room. The word hope was written in neat letters at the top of the page. Mr. Jones felt tears well up. "Connor, these are beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you. Art can say the things we can't always put into words. Never stop drawing, okay?" Connor nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He felt a warmth in his chest, a growing sense that he was no longer alone in the world. As time passed, Connor continued therapy sessions with Mrs. Anderson and occasionally with an outside counselor recommended by social services. He worked through the trauma of the abuse, learning to trust and to understand that he wasn't responsible for what had happened. At first, he had nightmares, waking up in cold sweats, certain that Michael was in the hallway waiting for him. But each time, he found only the soft, reassuring light of the apartment corridor. Sometimes Mr. Jones would hear him stirring and come in, gently reminding him he was safe. Gradually, the nightmares lessened, replaced by dreams of normal, everyday things, playing soccer in the park, painting a sunrise, laughing with friends. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Michael and Rebecca proceeded. They faced multiple charges related to child abuse, including physical harm and neglect. Connor was called to provide testimony via a recorded statement, sparing him from having to appear in court again. Though the legal jargon and formalities were overwhelming, Mr. Jones stayed by his side, offering reassurance. The final verdict was still pending, but the general consensus was that the Reynolds would face severe legal consequences, likely prison time, and permanent revocation of their license to foster. Throughout these months, Olivia and Connor's friendship blossomed. She introduced him to some of her hobbies, reading fantasy novels, baking chocolate chip cookies with her mother's supervision, and even gardening in their small backyard patch. In turn, Connor showed her how to sketch small figures and faces, patiently guiding her hand with the pencil. When they laughed, it echoed with a kind of joy that Connor once thought he'd never feel again. There were bumps along the way. Connor still struggled with moments of panic, sometimes triggered by small things like a raised voice in the hallway or a sudden movement from a student playing around. He also had to catch up academically, having missed chunks of school due to the chaos in his life. Mr. Jones tutored him in math after dinner, and they spent weekends visiting museums or going for walks, both to widen Connor's worldview and to help him find beauty in the ordinary. Finally, after several months of living under Mr. Jones's roof, Connor learned that Mr. Jones wanted to move from fostering to adopting him permanently. The realization was almost too overwhelming for words. When Mr. Jones mentioned it casually one evening, as if asking about the weather, Connor felt tears welling up. "Really?" he asked in a shaky voice. Mr. Jones smiled gently. "Yes, if you want that. I can't imagine my life without you now. We might as well make it official." Connor nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. "I'd really like that," he whispered. Of course, there were legal processes involved in adoption as well, more paperwork, home visits, and evaluations. Yet given the circumstances, and with Mr. Jones's stable background and obvious commitment, the path was smoother than most. Connor found himself looking forward to a future he had once believed impossible. He even started envisioning high school, college, and beyond, no longer weighed down by the chain of fear and uncertainty. By the time the adoption was finalized in a small ceremony at the local courthouse, Connor was 13 years old, standing alongside Mr. Jones, who was now officially his father in every sense that mattered. Mrs. Anderson attended, beaming with pride, and Olivia showed up with her mom, carrying a small bouquet of flowers that she handed to Connor. Even Mr. Milton, the bus driver, stopped by to shake Connor's hand and wish him well. It was a simple ceremony, but its emotional significance was immeasurable. That day marked the culmination of a long, painful journey from isolation and abuse to the promise of love and security. Back at school, life moved on with all the trivial routines that suddenly felt like privileges to Connor. He complained about homework, giggled with Olivia during group assignments, and groaned when they had to run laps in gym class, normal childhood experiences that once seemed out of reach. He drew happier pictures now, using brighter colors and capturing the soft lines of a hopeful future. He was still quiet by nature, still a bit timid, but no longer trapped by a suffocating sense of dread. Eventually, the final legal blow came for Michael and Rebecca Reynolds. They were sentenced to serve time for child abuse and neglect. Though Connor felt no compassion for them, he did feel a complex mix of relief and sorrow, sadness for the fact that such cruelty existed, but also relief that they could no longer harm another child. With the case closed, he could truly begin to heal and move forward. One sunny afternoon, Connor walked home from school with Mr. Jones. They chatted about mundane things. The upcoming art contest at school, whether they should cook spaghetti or tacos for dinner, and a new graphic novel series Connor wanted to read. For a moment, Connor paused at the corner, looking up at Mr. Jones with gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you for everything," he said softly. Mr. Jones smiled, ruffling Connor's hair. "Thank you for trusting us," he replied. They continued on, the sidewalk dappled with golden sunlight, leaves rustling gently overhead. In that small, everyday moment, Connor felt the profound simplicity of being safe and loved. It was more than a year since Connor first boarded that school bus with a cry for help. The transformation in his life was remarkable, yet not without scars. He still carried emotional wounds, memories that snuck up on him when he least expected them. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd jolt awake, gasping, afraid that Michael's voice might call him from the hallway. But every time, he remembered whose home he was in now. He breathed in, calming himself, and felt the security of the walls around him that held no threat. Each day, the nightmares grew weaker, replaced by a sense of normalcy and possibility. At school, other students noticed the difference in Connor. He was still shy, but he had friends now. Besides Olivia, there were a few boys who shared his interest in comic books, and a girl who enjoyed painting watercolor landscape. He joined the art club, submitting some of his pieces to the school's spring art exhibition. When Mrs. Anderson saw the piece he was working on, a bright depiction of hands coming together around a small plant, she smiled. "What's it called?" she asked. Connor paused, thinking. Then he said quietly, "Growth." Near the end of that school year, the art exhibition was held in the gym, showcasing students' drawings, paintings, and sculptures. Parents and community members came to admire the young talent. Connor's piece stood out for its vivid color and emotional resonance, drawing a small crowd. He lingered nearby, somewhat embarrassed by the attention. Mr. Jones stood next to him, resting a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Look at that," he said quietly, nodding at the group of onlookers praising Connor's artwork. "You made something that's touching people." Connor blushed. "It's not that big a deal," he murmured. But he couldn't hide his smile. Indeed, the piece resonated with many, including some teachers who knew Connor's story. It symbolized rebirth, unity, and the power of nurturing care, everything Connor had experienced since being rescued from his abusive situation. When one of the judges announced that Connor's piece won first prize in the middle school category, applause echoed through the gym. Connor stood there, stunned, before receiving the ribbon. He glanced at Mr. Jones, who gave him a thumbs up. Mrs. Anderson, present in the crowd, wiped away tears of joy. It was a moment of triumph that encapsulated Connor's journey from a frightened, bruised child into a resilient young artist. In the weeks that followed, Connor's nightmares grew less frequent, and his sense of belonging grew stronger. He and Olivia would sometimes walk home together, laughing about classmates or discussing new sketches and stories they planned to create. On weekends, he and Mr. Jones would go to the local park, tossing a frisbee or strolling by the pond to feed duck. Each snapshot of normal life felt like a gift Connor never took for granted. Then came the last day of school before summer break. Students buzzed with excitement, talking about vacations, camps, or just the chance to sleep in. Connor cleaned out his locker, placing textbooks and notebooks into his backpack. As he shut the locker door, he paused for a moment, thinking back to the first day he'd arrived at Oakwood Middle School. Scared, silent, harboring bruises both visible and hidden. It felt like a different world now. He remembered how Mr. Jones had offered him a lifeline, how Mrs. Anderson's gentle questions had let him know someone cared, how Olivia's open heart had shown him kindness when he most needed it. Standing there, he realized the significance of every step on that journey. Connor slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked down the hallway, passing the artwork he had made in art class. He saw the reflection of himself in one of the display cases, noticing how tall he had grown, how his posture looked straighter. A contented breath slipped from his lips. He felt a wave of gratitude for all the help he had received along the way, from the bus driver who first reported his plea, to Mr. Carter, the social worker who conducted the investigations, to the judge who recognized the truth. And most of all, to Mr. Jones for providing not just a home, but a family. When the dismissal bell rang, Connor headed out the front doors into the warm sunlight. Mr. Jones waited by the car, waving cheerfully. Connor jogged over, a new kind of excitement coursing through him. "Ready for summer?" Mr. Jones asked, opening the passenger door for him. Connor nodded vigorously. "Yeah. I can't wait to." He paused, trying to decide which of the many new experiences he was looking forward to most. "Just to have a great time," he concluded with a grin. That summer, Mr. Jones enrolled him in a local art workshop for young artists. Connor loved every minute of it, exploring new techniques, meeting peers who shared his passion, and finding yet another supportive community. He spent hours in his room at home, refining his drawings, adding layers of color and nuance that reflected how he felt inside, hopeful, determined, and quietly strong. Every so often, his old fears would resurface, but each time, he confronted them with the knowledge that he had survived and that he was finally safe. As the years passed, the bond between Connor and Mr. Jones only grew stronger. Connor saw a counselor periodically to continue working through lingering trauma, and with every session, he discovered more about his own resilience. He realized that speaking the truth, no matter how terrifying, was the key that had unlocked his cage. It was a lesson he would carry with him throughout his life, a reminder that courage didn't mean not being afraid, it meant acting despite the fear. By the time Connor reached high school, his artwork had garnered recognition beyond Oakwood's borders. He participated in regional art competitions, sometimes winning awards, sometimes merely learning from the experience. Along the way, he stayed close friends with Olivia, who blossomed into a confident, kind-hearted teenager herself. They studied together, attended school dances, as friends, though Connor suspected she might want more, and he found that the idea didn't scare him anymore, and encouraged each other to pursue their dreams. Meanwhile, Mr. Jones continued to be the steady, supportive presence in Connor's life. There were, of course, the typical teenage arguments, disagreements about curfews, debates over chores, but they resolved them with mutual respect, a far cry from the violent, oppressive environment Connor once knew. Through it all, Connor never stopped drawing. His sketches evolved to depict not just fear or hope, but the subtleties of everyday life. A breakfast table with the morning sun streaming in, the angle of a friend's laughter, the glow of streetlights on a rainy night. One day, a letter arrived from a specialized art program, inviting Connor to attend a summer course that could pave the way for scholarship. He tore the envelope open with shaky hands, reading the words with mounting excitement. When Mr. Jones came home, Connor nearly sprinted to meet him at the door, waving the acceptance letter. "I got in," he shouted, unable to hide his grin. Mr. Jones swept him into a hug. "That's fantastic," he replied, eyes shining with pride. The smell of dinner cooking filled the apartment, and for a moment, Connor thought back to those dark days when he never imagined feeling so at ease, so genuinely happy. He savored the memory of that meager suitcase he had carried out of Michael and Rebecca's home, containing only a handful of clothes and a battered sketchbook. He had come so far since then. Every once in a while, Connor revisited the darkest pages of his old sketchbook as a reminder. He would run his fingertips over the rough lines, recall the fear etched into every stroke, and then close it, returning to the present, a life filled with support and opportunity. It was not a denial of his past, but an acknowledgement of how much he had overcome. Gradually, he even found a semblance of forgiveness for himself. He understood that nothing that happened at the Reynolds home was his fault. He was a child, and they were the abusers. Despite everything, he had survived. Though lingering legal issues persisted, such as the final sentencing for Michael and Rebecca and the question of whether they would ever be free to foster again, unlikely as it was, Connor distanced himself from those concerns. He had given his testimony, shared the truth, and found a new life. Let the justice system deal with them. He was focused on the future, improving his art, exploring college options, and navigating the normal ups and downs of teenage life. One balmy afternoon in late spring, Mr. Jones and Connor were cooking dinner together. Steam rose from a pot of tomato sauce while Mr. Jones chopped fresh basil. Connor stirred the sauce, occasionally sneaking a taste. The smell was comforting, reminiscent of the numerous dinners they had shared since he moved in. As they worked, Mr. Jones looked at Connor and said quietly, "I'm proud of you every day, you know that?" Connor felt a warm rush of affection. "I'm proud of you too," he replied, "for being there for me." They set the table and sat down to eat. The conversation flowed easily. School projects, weekend plans, a new painting technique Connor had learned. Outside, a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves of the trees that lined the street. Connor felt a calm, steady sense of gratitude. He remembered the terror of that morning on the bus, the frantic plea for help, the nightmares that haunted him night after night. Those memories would never fully disappear, but they had transformed into markers of how far he had come. After dinner, Connor excused himself to his room, laying out a blank page in his latest sketchbook. He began drawing a simple scene, a boy walking through an open door into a sunlit room. The boy's expression was one of awe and relief, while, in the background, a figure gently held the door wide open. Connor spent a long time on the details, shading the corners, capturing the warmth of the light. When he finished, he wrote a single word under the image, "Home." Several months later, on a clear morning that signaled the start of another school year, Connor stepped out of Mr. Jones's car. He had grown taller over the summer, his face more defined, a look of cautious confidence in his eyes. He waved goodbye to Mr. Jones and then walked toward the school's entrance, where Olivia was waiting, bouncing on her heels. She had new sneakers and was excited to show them off. "Connor," she called, her smile wide. He grinned back. It was a small, ordinary moment, but for Connor, every ordinary moment now felt precious, a testament to the life he had reclaimed. He walked into Oakwood High, an adjacent building to the middle school he once entered with bruises and fear. This time, his stride was sure, and the only thing on his arms was the occasional smudge of graphite from his sketches. He took a deep breath, letting the bustle of students fill his senses. The distant echo of a teacher's announcement crackled through the loudspeaker. Lockers slammed, friends reunited, schedules were checked. Connor glanced around, feeling that old swirl of excitement mixed with nerves that a new school year brings, but no longer weighed down by dread. He noticed a younger student looking lost in the hallway, hugging a stack of textbooks. Something about the child's anxious expression reminded him of himself not too long ago. Connor walked over and asked, "Need help finding your class?" The kid nodded shyly. Connor took the schedule and pointed to a room number. "That's on the second floor, right hallway," he said, offering a friendly smile. The child smiled back, relieved. "Thanks," he murmured before scurrying off. In that moment, Connor felt a surge of empathy. He realized how life had come full circle in some ways. Once he was the lost boy, now he was guiding someone else. At lunch, Connor found Olivia at a table and joined her. They talked excitedly about new teachers, extracurricular clubs, and future plans. Despite the typical teenage banter, an undercurrent of gratitude coursed through Connor. He was free. He was cared for. He had a chance to shape his future in a way he never thought possible. That evening, back at Mr. Jones's apartment, Connor spent time finishing up homework before settling in to sketch. After half an hour, he leaned back, satisfied with his work. A whimsical scene of a child lying on a hill, looking up at the stars, each star shining like a beacon of possibility. He flipped back through older pages, noticing the evolution of his drawings from fear to hope, from darkness to light. Gently closing the sketchbook, he let out a soft sigh of contentment. He heard footsteps in the hallway, and Mr. Jones popped his head in. "Hey, I'm heading out for a quick run to the grocery store. Need anything?" Connor shook his head. "I'm good," he answered. Mr. Jones nodded, stepping away. As Connor heard the apartment door close, a sense of peace descended on him. No dread, no looming fear, just the comforting knowledge that soon Mr. Jones would return. They'd watch a bit of TV or chat about the day, and then sleep would come without nightmares. In the quiet, Connor let himself reflect on everything that had happened in the past year and a half. He recalled how he used to think that asking for help was impossible, that no one would believe him. Yet so many people had stepped up when he finally found the courage to speak. The bus driver, the teachers, the counselor, the social worker, and even a quiet friend who shared her lunch. Connor realized that the world could be cruel, but it could also be kind, and that kindness had saved him. Now, every day he discovered new reasons to be grateful, to keep moving forward, to embrace the future he once believed he would never have. Time would keep moving. He would face new challenges, classes, friendships, heartbreaks, and triumphs. But he would face them knowing he was no longer alone. He had a home, a family, and a support system that cared deeply for him. He had turned his pain into art, and his fear into resolve. And in the process, he had learned the most precious lesson of all: speaking up, despite the terror, was worth it. It meant living in truth, and opening the door to a life that promised so much more than mere survival. He set his pencil down and turned off the lamp, ready to get some rest. In the soft darkness, he whispered 2 words to himself, words he once only dreamed he could say without dread: "I'm safe." A small smile tugged at his lips as he climbed under the covers. Tomorrow would be a new day, another step forward. He closed his eyes, heartbeat steady, mind drifting to images of bright skies and new beginnings. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.